Hello everyone, this is Rachna Singh with another chapter from Vistas for Class 12, The Enemy. It's written by Pearl S. Buck. Before we move on for the chapter, let's know about the writer. Pearl S. Buck, who was born in 1892 and died in the year 1973, was an American writer and novelist. She had a Chinese name, Tsai Zhanzu, and she spent her childhood in China. Being the daughter of missionary, she was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in the year 1932 and the Nobel Prize in Literature in the year 1938. The story is set during the Second World War. A Japanese doctor finds an American paw at his doorstep. He is in a dilemma that being a doctor, should he save the wounded man, or being a Japanese, should he hand over the enemy to the army? So let's move for the explanation of the chapter. The writer introduces the main character of the story, Dr. Sadao Hoki. Sadao's house was situated on the coast of Japan. He had been living there since his childhood. The house had a low height and was made of stone. It was set upon the rocky beach, which had a boundary line made with pine trees that were tilted towards one side. When Dr. Sadao was a child, he would climb up the pine trees. On his visit to the South Seas, he would see men do so in order to get coconuts from the trees. He would accompany his father to the island of the South Seas often. His father would point towards the island and would say that those were the stepping stones towards the future of Japan. Dr. Sadao would question him childishly that where would they reach from those islands? His father would reply that it was not known as it depended on the future. The future had no limit. It depended on mankind, how it shaped its future. Sadao retained all the things that his father would tell him as a child. His father never played or joked with him. They shared a mature relation, and his father underwent a lot of hardships to bring him up. Sadao knew that his father was concerned about his education. He was sent to America at the age of 22 to study surgery and medicine. He returned at the age of 30. Before dying, Sadao's father saw Sadao become famous not only as a surgeon but also as a scientist. Sadao was on his way to discover a treatment for wounds which would make them absolutely clean. So he was not sent abroad with the armed forces as a doctor. Also, he was retained in Japan because the old general was suffering from an ailment which needed to be operated upon in case of an emergency. The writer describes the scene outside Dr. Sadao's house. As the days were unusually warm and the sea waves were cold, the nights became foggy. Dr. Sadao saw the boundary of a nearby island become invisible gradually as it got covered in the mist. Slowly the mist was coming closer to him. Soon there would be mist all around his house. At that time, he would go back into the house to his wife, Hannah, who was waiting for him along with their two children. Before Sadao could go inside, the door opened and his wife looked out for him. She was wearing a dark blue colored gown over her dress. She lovingly crossed her arm with her smile at him, remained silent, and stood by him. They had met in America. Sadao knew that his father would marry him to a Japanese girl only, and so he ensured this before falling in love with her. Sadao considered himself to be lucky to have accidentally met her at a American professor's house. He wondered that he had not met her, he would not have got a wife all his life. He thought that the professor and his wife were kind as they were keen to help foreign students. He was glad that they had accepted its kindness and went to their house because it was there that he had met Hannah. Sadao would often tell Hannah that it was a mere coincidence that he went to the professor's house that night as the rooms in his house were small, the food was not good, and the professor's wife was very talkative. If he had not gone there that night, he would not have met Hannah. At that time, Hannah was a new student. Sadao had thought that he would love her if at all it would be possible for him. Sadao and Hannah loved each other even after having two children. After many years of marriage, they had not married in a haste in America, rather than returned to Japan, sought permission from their parents, and then got married in a traditional Japanese ceremony. They had discussed all the details before the wedding. They were happy with each other. Hannah rested her cheek against Sadao's arm with affection. That moment, they saw a figure appear out of the mist. It appeared black in color due to the mist in the air. The outline of a man's body was visible in the mist. He walked unsteadily with his arms above the head. It was an indication that he was a prisoner. The man walked a few steps and then disappeared in the mist. Upon seeing the figure, Hannah reacted by asking that who was that? She took her arm out of Sadao's arm and both of them bent forward over the railing of the veranda to have a closer look at the man. They saw him again. He was crawling on his hands and knees. Then he fell on his face and kept on lying there. Probably he had fainted. As the area had villages full of fishermen, Sadao said that probably it was a fisherman who had been washed off his boat. He ran to help him. Hannah followed him. The loose leaves of her hair flew as she ran. This part of the coast was not inhabited and it had dangerous rocks on it. As the rocks were pointed, the man could be badly injured, although he had managed to come through them. As the Japanese couple saw the man, they realized that he was badly injured. The sand on which he lay had blood stains on one side, which indicated that he was wounded. Sadao said that the man was wounded. He approached the man who lay motionless with his face buried in the sand. An old cap hung on his head. It was soaked with the sea water. His dress was also wet and torn. Sadao turned the man's head. As they saw the face, Hannah spoke confidentially that he was a white, an American. The injured man was an American. As his cap fell off, they saw his wet, yellow colored hair, which had not been cut for a long time. He was young. His face had such marks which indicated that he had been tortured. He had a rough, unkempt yellow colored beard. As he had fainted, he did not know of the presence of Sadao and Hannah. Sadao was reminded that the man was wounded as he had seen bloodstains on the sand. As he was a doctor, he moved his trained fingers around the man's back to search for the wound. He felt blood oozing out of the wound in the lower part of his back. It was a gunshot. The man had been injured a few days ago. He had not got any medical help to treat the wound, as he had himself used some black colored powdery substance on it. The sharp rocks on the shore had pierced it, and so it was bleeding. Hannah was concerned that the man was injured and said in a low voice that he was bleeding. The mist has intensified now. The three of them could not be spotted by anyone. Moreover, the fishermen and the rag pickers did not visit the place at that time of the day. Sadao answered to himself and said that the best thing was to put the man back into the sea. As the bleeding stopped, he stood up and removed the dust from his hands. Hannah supported his opinion but looked intently at the man as he lay still. Sadao said that if they gave him shelter, they would be arrested for sheltering an enemy. if they handed him over to the Japanese army as a prisoner, then he would die in the prison, as he thought that both the opinions or options were not favorable. So the best option was to put him back into the sea. Hannah added that the kindest act for them was to put him back into the sea. Both of them did not move ahead to do so, rather, they stared at the motionless figure with dislike. They disliked him because he was an enemy, an American. Hannah was inquisitive as she asked about the man's identity. Sadao replied that he appeared to be an American. He picked up the torn cap and read the words written on it, which were slightly visible. He said that the man was a sailor from an American warship and read out the word U.S. Navy written on the cap. They concluded that the man had been taken into captivity during the war. Sadao and Hannah discussed that the man had tried to escape from the prison and had been shot in the back. They were not able to gather the courage to throw him into the sea. Hannah called upon Sadao with firmness. She asked him if he was ready to put him into the sea. Sadao told her that he was able to do so and asked that did Hannah have the courage for it. Hannah replied in the negative and added that if he could not do it by himself, then she had to help him. Sadao was reluctant in throwing the man into the sea. He reasoned that if the man was well, he would have handed him over to the police without any hesitation. He added that he was not concerned about the man and considered him to be an enemy as he was an American. He commented that the injured man was a common man as his face looked as if he was a foolish person. He wanted to say that he was not bothered about the injured man, but his only concern was that he was wounded. Hannah said that if he could not throw him into the sea, then the second option was to carry him home. Sada was concerned that the servants would object as they would shelter an enemy. Hannah said that they would tell them that they intended to hand him over to the police once he recovered. She told him that they must do that. She added that they must consider their children's future and Sadao's position. If they did not hand over a prisoner of war to the police, they would be in danger. Sadao replied that certainly he would do so and he did not think of doing anything else. Sadao and Hannah lifted the injured man into the house. He was very light. The writer compares his weight to that of a hen that has not been fed for a long time and its body loses flesh and reduces into mere feathers and skeleton. The man's arms were hanging and the deer carried him up the steps into the side door of the house. The door opened into a passage and they went down the passage towards an empty bedroom. The bedroom belonged to Sadao's father and had not been used after his death. The injured man was laid on the thick mat on the floor. The writer described the room. Everything in the room was Japanese, as Sadao's father disliked foreign things. Hannah went to the cupboard in the wall and took off a soft quilt. She resisted putting it onto the injured man. The quilt was made of silk, had a flowery print on it, and the lining was made of pure white silk. She was sad and spoke slowly that the man was very dirty. Sadao said that the man had to be washed. Sadao asked Hannah to get hot water so that he could wash the man. Hannah did not want that Sadao should touch the man. She said that they would ask the servant to wash the injured man. She would call Yumi to leave attending the children for a few minutes and wash him. Sadao thought for a moment and then agreed to Hannah. He asked her to call Yumi while he would call the other servants. Before he could go out, he saw the injured man's face. It was so pale that he stopped, bent forward, and felt his heartbeat to see if he was alive. The heartbeats were very faint, but it was there. Then Sadao placed his hand on the man's heart to feel it. It was also beating. Sadao concluded thus that the injured man was alive. Sadao commented that if the man was not operated upon, he would die. He added that even if he was operated upon and saved, he would die at the hands of Japanese army. So either ways he would die. Hannah screamed with fear and asked Sadao not to save the man. She feared that if he lived, they would be in danger. Sadao questioned that what would be the implications if the man died. He looked down towards the injured man and wondered that he had a lot of energy, which had kept him alive through such torture. He countered his thought with the fact that the man was very young. He seemed to be 25 years of age, and at that age, people do have a lot of energy. Hannah asked him that did he mean the man could die during the operation. Sadao confirmed the question. Hannah was pondering over this possibility, and as she was taking time to reply, Sadao left. He said that something had to be done with the injured man, irrespective of the result. The first thing was to wash him. As he walked out of the room, Hannah followed him. She did not want to remain in the room alone with the white skinned men. She, she had left America. She was the first white man she had seen. She had no contact with Americans whom she had met as they were her enemies. This injured man was also an enemy and was a threat to them. Hannah turned to the children's room and called out to Yumi. As the children heard her voice, she went inside, smiled at them, and played with her 3-month-old son. As she held the baby with soft black hair, she motioned with her mouth to Yumi, asking her to come. Yumi replied that the baby was ready for sleep and that she must put it to sleep before accompanying her. Hannah held the baby and went to the bedroom next to the nursery with Yumi. Yumi spread the sleeping quilts on the floor and laid the baby between them. Hannah led the way as they walked fast towards the kitchen. The two servants in the kitchen were scared after hearing the master's words regarding the injured men. The old gardener, who also worked as a servant, was pondering over the news and pulling the hair from his upper lip. The old gardener spoke bluntly to Hannah. He said that Sadao must not treat the injured white man. He reasoned that the man was destined to die. Firstly, he had been wounded by a gunshot, and secondly, the rocks of the sea wounded him further. If Sadao healed the wounds given by the gun and the sea, then the gun and the sea would treat them as enemies and seek revenge. The gun represents the Japanese army, and the sea represents the country of Japan. If they treated the enemy, they would be punished by Japan. Hannah politely said to the gardener that she would pass his message to Sadao. She was frightened, though not superstitious like the old man. She thought that helping an enemy could never be good for them. Still, she asked Yumi to get hot water into the room where the injured man was kept. In the next video, see you soon. Bye bye.